something about Flight 19 hits differently. 5 Navy planes take off on a routine training run, the kind crews had done so many times it barely felt worth mentioning. A few hours later, every one of those planes is gone. The rescue aircraft sent to find them blows up in mid-air, and by the time the sun rises the next morning, the US Navy realizes it's dealing with the kind of disappearance that shouldn't be possible. How do 5 planes, 27 men, and an entire rescue crew vanish without leaving a single trace? NAS Fort Lauderdale was one of the places where World War tension was loudest. The war demanded pilots at a pace that wasn't human, and even after the fighting ended, the training pipeline didn't slow down. The Navy needed fresh aviators ready for whatever came next, and that meant long days, longer nights, and a constant stream of trainees cycling through cramped classrooms, crowded hangars, and runways that echoed from sunrise to well past sunset. The instructors were supposed to keep everything running smoothly, but they were running on fumes. Many had just come back from combat tours. Others were barely older than the men they were teaching. They were dealing with malfunctioning radios, outdated equipment, and weather reports that were half guesswork. Storm fronts rolled in without warning, cloud banks swallowed entire stretches of ocean, and compasses spun wildly if you were even slightly off course. And because of that, accidents were everywhere. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 100 men died in training crashes around the Fort Lauderdale area. Alone. Planes slammed into the ocean. Others landed miles off course. Some simply disappeared. Most of the time there were no headlines, no national attention, and no mystery documentary years later. This was the environment that shaped how everyone saw Flight 19. When those 5 Avengers lifted off, no one thought they were witnessing the start of one of the most famous disappearances in American history. And the strain on the system becomes even clearer when you look at the men who climbed into those planes. The 5 trainees weren't faceless names in a report. They were young men who still joked with mechanics, folded love letters into their pockets, and walked onto the flight line carrying confidence, nerves, ambition, and everything in between. Each one brought something different to the cockpit. Captain Edward Powers had the kind of presence people noticed without him trying. He was sharp and certain in a way that made others trust him. He'd recently gotten married, and the ring on his finger was still new enough that he kept twisting it out of habit. He studied hard, listened well, and took the responsibility of flying seriously. If you put him in unfamiliar airspace, he stayed calm. If clouds closed in, he evaluated and adjusted. He was the kind of trainee instructors liked having around. Then there was Captain George Stivers, disciplined to the bone, the rule follower in the group. He flew by the manual the way some people followed religion. Checklists mattered. Procedures mattered. He believed the chain of command existed for a reason, and when he heard an order, he didn't second-guess it. Stivers wasn't the fastest or the flashiest flyer, but he was steady. In a world full of chaos, he relied on structure. And on a day that would soon spiral into disorientation and fear, that instinct to follow the playbook would end up trapping him. Second Lieutenant Forrest Gerber had the kind of energy you can spot from a distance. Young, ambitious, and desperate to prove himself. He had the mindset of someone who felt the clock ticking. Men his age had gone to war, fought, died, and returned with stories. Gerber had trained, waited, and now finally had his shot to show he belonged. He pushed himself harder than he needed to. He double-checked every gauge before takeoff. He wanted his instructors to see he was ready for more than training runs over calm water. Ensign Joseph Bossy was different. Quiet, careful, the type who didn't talk unless he had something worth saying. He didn't draw attention, didn't show off, didn't try to impress. But when he worked, he was laser-focused. Instructors trusted him with fine, detailed tasks because he didn't cut corners. He took complex equipment apart just to understand how it worked. He didn't love crowds or noise, but he loved flying. That space where the world narrows down to instruments, wind and instinct. And towering over all of them, whether he wanted to or not, was Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Taylor had real combat experience, the kind that changes a man's shoulders, the way he listens, the way he reacts to sudden silence. He'd flown torpedo bombers in the Pacific, and he carried those memories everywhere. He had decorations, respect, and hours in the cockpit that most instructors envied. But experience doesn't erase fatigue, it builds it. And by the time Taylor arrived at NAS Fort Lauderdale, he was a man running on the afterburn of everything he'd already survived. People who knew him said he was smart but tightly wound. professional, but increasingly anxious, skilled, but fraying around the edges in a way he tried to hide. And on the morning of December 5th, something about him was off. Not enough to alarm the chain of command, but enough that the air traffic controller, the one who would spend decades replaying that day, remembered it with uncomfortable clarity. Taylor showed up late. Not just a few minutes, late enough that the entire schedule shifted. He arrived rushed, distracted, almost jumpy. He complained about his compasses before anyone even asked him about pre-flight checks. He looked at the cockpit like it was hiding something from him. The ATC later said he seemed tense in a way that didn't match the weather, the mission, or the routine of the day. Most instructors would have grounded themselves for that. But in 1945, you didn't do that. You didn't say you weren't fit to fly, you didn't admit exhaustion, you didn't show weakness. That culture of unshakable confidence was drilled into every officer. Once Taylor arrived, the mission was already in motion, and stopping it would have required him to raise his hand and say something was wrong. He didn't. Instead, he took command of 4 trainees who trusted him completely. They saw him as the steady one, the experienced one, the man who would guide them through every turn and every leg of the exercise. But the weight of leadership doesn't disappear just because the skies look calm. And if something inside him was unsettled that day, then his flight, without knowing it, walked into the air, carrying the same tension. The ATC would later insist that Taylor's mood mattered more than anyone realized. Not because he was reckless, but because he was human, tired, and out of place in Florida's particular maze of islands and cloud shadows. He didn't know this coastline like he knew the Pacific. He didn't know how the weather behaved here, and his instincts, honed in a different world, would soon collide with an environment that refused to play fair. And once they left the runway that afternoon, those doubts would collide with the chaos waiting above the Atlantic, where everything that could go wrong began to unravel. The strange thing about Flight 19 is that the assignment they were given that afternoon wasn't some complicated operation where 100 things could go wrong at once. It was the opposite. It was so basic that instructors joked a half-asleep trainee could pull it off. The Navy called it Navigation Problem Number 1, and this routine path was used to break in new pilots without overwhelming them. The steps were simple. Fly east over the Atlantic, hang a left up the coastline, then turn southwest back toward base. It was the kind of pattern you could draw with 3 straight lines and a triangle. And this is why the whole story becomes so confusing later, because this particular path was practically foolproof. Dead reckoning was the backbone of this exercise, the same method used by pilots long before fancy digital systems existed. The idea was straightforward. You track your heading, time and speed, and you always know your position. But there's one thing dead reckoning depends on more than anything else: clocks. If you can't measure how long you've been flying in a certain direction, everything else starts to slide out of place. And that's where Flight 19 already had a small problem before takeoff. Several of the planes didn't have functioning clocks. It wasn't unusual, and they were supposed to compensate using formation time, but it still meant the margin for error was thinner than usual. Then came the delay. The flight was supposed to depart earlier in the afternoon, but they couldn't. Taylor arrived late, stressed, unsettled, and worried about his equipment. That extra gap pushed the entire schedule into a window where the weather offshore was shifting. Throughout that week, Florida had been dealing with unpredictable conditions, patches of fog, quick-moving clouds, and sudden visibility drops. Nothing dangerous, but enough to throw off new pilots who didn't have much experience flying in coastal weather. An earlier takeoff likely would have kept them ahead of the mess. Instead, they flew straight into it. The shift happened in a single, sharp moment. Lieutenant Robert Cox, monitoring the usual radio traffic from the tower, suddenly heard a voice that didn't match the tone of a normal training run. It was tight, uneven, carrying the kind of stress that makes your stomach drop even before the words come through clearly. And then he heard it, the line that would echo in reports for decades. "We must have got lost after that last turn." Those weren't words you expected to hear on Navigation Problem Number 1. This was a flight leader admitting his group was disoriented in the middle of open water. Now, the ATC didn't panic. They dealt with plenty of rookie mistakes before. Usually they stepped in, gave a heading, and sent everyone home safely. But this time, the responses from Taylor didn't come the way they should have. Cox called back with instructions, but Taylor didn't confirm them. He didn't act on them. Sometimes he didn't reply at all. That's when the controller started paying closer attention. Taylor's tone didn't sound confused, it sounded convinced. He believed they were somewhere they absolutely were not. While the trainees kept insisting they needed to fly west, Taylor was telling them to hold east. The static from the weather wasn't helping. Half the words were coming through, broken or smeared together. But the pieces that came through clearly were enough to show that the group wasn't aligned. According to the ATC, Taylor wasn't just ignoring instructions by mistake. The controller later said he believed Taylor ignored ground calls on purpose. Not out of arrogance, but because he genuinely thought he outranked the voices trying to guide him. In the chain of command, rank mattered. It shaped every decision, every action, every correction. If Taylor believed he was higher in authority than the controller speaking to him, he may have felt he had the final say, not the ground crew. Pilots were trained to trust themselves, especially those with combat experience. And Taylor had plenty of that. So when he became convinced they were in the wrong place, nothing the trainees said, and nothing the tower insisted on, could pull him away from that belief. The trainees, though, were having a different experience. Cox could hear the tension rising in their voices. They were running out of daylight, their fuel was dropping, and they could tell the weather was getting worse. They were begging to turn west. They knew that direction pointed back to Florida. The coastline wasn't far. They just needed their leader to greenlight the move. But Taylor held firm. He kept them flying east, deeper into the open Atlantic. And once the radio started failing completely, the final stretch of the story turned from confusion into a countdown. The first big question everyone always circles back to is simple. How do both compasses on Taylor's plane fail at the exact same time? On paper, that shouldn't happen. Military compasses were built to be rugged, reliable, and resistant to the kind of minor disturbances you'd expect over the ocean. Even if one failed, the second should have worked as backup. But during the flight, Taylor radioed in saying both were giving him trouble. That single moment changed the tone of the mission, because once a pilot loses faith in his heading, every decision becomes guesswork. The ATC didn't dismiss the report, but they didn't buy it completely either. What stood out most wasn't what Taylor said, it was what nobody else did. Not a single other pilot in the formation mentioned compass issues. 5 planes, 10 compasses, and only Taylor reported a failure. Even more curious, no other flights that day experienced instrument trouble. The weather wasn't calm, but it wasn't the kind that knocks out compasses. There were no electrical storms, no major magnetic disturbances, nothing that would explain a double malfunction. The clouds were thick in places, visibility dropped at moments, but that only affects what you see, not what your instruments read. That's why the ATC starts getting suspicious in hindsight. The controller later said the compasses didn't seem wrong from how Taylor was describing them. They sounded more like he wasn't trusting what he saw. There's a difference between a compass that's broken and a compass that doesn't match what a pilot expects. And this is where a detail comes in that never made it into official reports. When the ATC revisited the events years later, he mentioned that Taylor had complained earlier that week about those very same compasses. He didn't file a formal report, but he did tell maintenance crews that something didn't feel right. When they checked the plane, everything worked fine. Nothing was replaced. Nothing was recorded. So when Taylor took off on December 5th, he carried that concern with him. Knowing that suddenly reframes everything. If you start a flight already unsure about your instruments, you're more likely to second-guess them the moment anything unexpected happens. When the ATC reviewed the recordings years later, one thing stood out. Taylor repeatedly returned to his compasses in conversation, almost obsessively. He would mention them even when it didn't fit the flow of the radio exchange. This raises the question that still hangs over the case. Did Taylor expect a failure before he ever left the ground? And if so, did that mindset influence everything that happened afterward? The turning point, the moment everything snapped from confusion into full disaster, came when Taylor looked down and made a decision that sealed the fate of the entire mission. He saw a stretch of pale sand cutting across deep blue water, long, thin, almost glowing under the late afternoon sun. To him, it looked like the Florida Keys. That meant land was right beneath him, and if that was true, he was somewhere along the southern coast of the state. The only problem is that he wasn't. He was looking at the Bahamas. On maps, the Keys and the Bahamian Islands don't look remotely similar. But from the air, especially at the wrong altitude, in bad light, with cloud shadows breaking up the surface. The brain fills in gaps with whatever it wants to see, and Taylor wanted to see Florida. He needed to see Florida. His fuel was dropping, the weather was turning. His trainees kept asking for direction, so his mind locked onto the first familiar shape it could find, even if it was wrong. The official report tried to soften this part by blaming weather and stress. But the ATC tells a sharper story. He says the tower figured out much earlier than the records admit that Taylor wasn't anywhere near Florida. They knew he'd gone too far east. They knew he was drifting toward the open Atlantic. They knew the islands below him weren't the Keys, but nobody wanted to override him. He was a decorated combat pilot. He had more flight hours and more combat experience than anyone guiding him over the radio. He had survived situations that most of the controllers had only read about in briefings. In that era, that kind of resume created a force field. You didn't question men like him unless you were absolutely sure. And because the weather was messing with the signal, and because the compass story confused the picture, nobody felt certain enough to challenge his call. The trainees didn't dare push back either. They weren't just students, they were young men who'd been taught the Navy chain of command as gospel. Speaking up wasn't seen as helpful, it was seen as insubordination. Inside the ATC, the tension was rising fast. Staff members argued about whether to escalate the situation, whether to call in higher command, whether to send another plane out to intercept. But every argument ended the same way. Someone would remind the room that Taylor wasn't a rookie. He was the kind of pilot you trust. This was the sliding doors moment, the point where everything could still have been saved. If someone in the tower had stepped up and said, "He's wrong, turn west right now," the planes would have reached the Florida coast before their fuel ran out. The whole story swings in a darker direction the moment the radios start acting like a doorway to nowhere. Up until then, the flights were confused but reachable. But when Taylor refused to switch to the search and rescue frequency, everything the rescuers needed to save those men collapsed in real time. While they thought, let's get him on the SAR channel so we can triangulate, Taylor thought, if I switch, I lose whatever shaky thread I still have. And that gap in understanding cost them the one tool that could have drawn a map straight to Flight 19. The search and rescue frequency was designed for one purpose: lock onto a pilot's signal so the triangulation towers could draw 3 lines and pinpoint the aircraft. But Taylor kept saying he wanted to stay on his training frequency because he thought it might help his squadron hear him better. The irony? Staying there made it harder for anyone to figure out where he actually was. Every second he stayed on that wrong frequency pushed the flight deeper into the part of the Atlantic where compasses go weak, signals bounce around, and the sky turns into a bad omen. And this is where the air traffic controller drops the bombshell decades later. He says the base refused to publicly blame Taylor for the frequency problem because dead pilots don't defend themselves. He claims the officers knew Taylor's refusal to switch was the one decision that sealed the fate of the entire squadron, but nobody wanted the headline to be "Lost Pilot Caused Own Death." That would have crushed the families and shattered morale inside a Navy already dealing with post-war pressure. So the official reports danced around the real issue. They blamed the weather, they blamed radio problems, they blamed anything except the one man who actually had control of the dial. But the truth is, the frequency wasn't the only thing stabbing holes through their chances. The Atlantic that day wasn't quiet. Cuban stations bled into their signals, spraying Spanish chatter right across US military channels. And once you hear what happened inside that tower, from the moment they realized Taylor was slipping past the point of no return, you'll understand why everyone in that room said the same thing. The clock hits 5:10 p.m. and the tower still thinks they have time. Not much, but enough. They believe that if Taylor just holds his heading, or finally switches frequencies, or gives them one clean transmission, they can drag this thing back under control. But the North Wind has other plans. It pushes Flight 19 farther into the open ocean with the kind of steady force that looks harmless on paper and deadly in real life. Every minute they drifted added another mile, and that drift turned their flight path into a slow slide off the map. Controllers start checking everything: logs, wind charts, previous transmissions, even the angle of static bursts to understand where the squadron might be. When you're desperate, you search for patterns in things that shouldn't matter. Finally, around 6 p.m, triangulation catches a signal, and what they see hits like a punch. Flight 19 isn't off course by a little. They're not drifting south. They're not approaching land. They're 100 miles farther out into the Atlantic than anyone expected. That realization stuns the room. Every controller remembers the silence afterward. But then something rare happened. Taylor made a moment of clarity. He said, "We'll fly 270 till landfall or we run out of gas." That was the decision that could have brought them home. Everyone in the tower leaned toward the speakers, as if that sentence alone could drag the planes closer. A heading of 270, a straight shot west, was the safe route. It meant land. It meant survival. It meant the nightmare finally had a crack of hope. For a few minutes, the tower believed the reality was shifting. They radioed updates. They repeated instructions. They held on to optimism, even though they knew the fuel situation was already bad. If Taylor kept that heading, the planes might glide close enough to see the coastline before darkness swallowed them. But then Taylor hesitated. He began questioning his own choice again. When a lost pilot doubts the one right decision he finally makes, everything collapses. And Taylor did exactly that. He doubted, turned, and erased the final path that could have saved them. The last minutes stretched out like a slow fade. The controllers tried to keep the pilots engaged. They repeated headings even though they knew Taylor wouldn't follow them. They tried to project confidence into their voices, even as they watched the ocean creeping into the final outcome. And then the transmission started shortening. Everything leading up to the final minutes feels chaotic, but this part hits with a different weight. The last message from Flight 19 doesn't come with panic or shouting. It comes with this steady, almost quiet acceptance from a squadron that knows their fuel is nearly gone. And the coastline they were chasing doesn't exist in the direction they're flying. The transmission is short, but it carries everything. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch. Those words are the last clean line anyone hears from the flight, and the simplicity makes them hit harder. It's the sound of trained men doing what they were taught to do when there's no land in sight, no fuel to burn, and no more time. Closing up tight was a survival instinct. If they ditched together, search crews might find a cluster of floating wreckage instead of scattered pieces spread across miles. That was the strategy. Stay tight, hit water close to each other, and hope the life rafts held until dawn. But this wasn't daylight. The seas weren't calm. They were flying over storm-chopped Atlantic water, under a sky that looked like a wall closing in. Ditching a TBM Avenger is one of the harshest landings a pilot can attempt, even when conditions are gentle. The plane is heavy, the frame is rigid, and the wings sit at an angle that doesn't play nicely with waves. The second the belly of the aircraft hits the water, the impact is violent. Crew members who trained on ditching knew this. They'd been told how the nose could grab the surface like a hook, pitch down, and shove the plane underwater in a heartbeat. That's in daylight. That's in quiet water. Now add 10 to 12-foot waves, darkness, and a pilot whose visibility is cut to almost nothing. That's the situation Flight 19 faced. Most historians believe the planes likely broke apart on impact. Not because of structural weakness, but because of the physics. When an Avenger slams water at that angle, the underside is crushed instantly, the wings snap, and the cockpit floods in seconds. Even if one or two planes survived the first hit, the storm would have flipped the wreckage before the men could escape. That's why no flares were reported. When the tower realized Flight 19 wasn't coming back on its own, they didn't hesitate. They launched a Mariner flying boat, the PBM-5, one of the Navy's standard long-range rescue planes. But the men who worked around these planes knew something the public didn't. The PBM held so much gasoline in its wing tanks that even a tiny leak could fill the interior with fumes. All it took was one spark, a shorted wire, a heated surface, static from the storm, and the entire plane could go up instantly. The Navy never advertised that reputation, but people on the ground talked about it quietly. The Mariner was reliable as a patrol plane, but during night missions in rough air, the risk climbed fast. The crew lifting off that night knew they were flying into challenging conditions. They were heading toward the same region, already battering Flight 19. Winds were pushing hard from the north, visibility was dropping, and radio interference was still crawling across the channels. But they took off anyway, because their job was recovery. They were the ones who searched when everyone else stayed home. The timing of what happened next is one of the reasons Flight 19's story refuses to fade. Just after the Avengers' radios went silent, the Mariner transmitted its standard 1930 radio check. That was routine, but that next call never came. Minutes later, a ship out on patrol reported seeing a massive fireball flash across the sky, an explosion so large it reflected off the water. They couldn't reach it. They couldn't investigate immediately. But the glow told its own story. A Mariner blowing up mid-air wasn't unheard of. Ugly as it sounds, crews had talked about it before. A fuel leak meets a spark and everything disappears in a single burst. And that's what the ship believed they saw. The PBM-5 the Navy had just sent into the darkness. The tower didn't hear an explosion directly. All they heard was silence. The same kind that came after Flight 19's last message. The controller who later described it said the silence after the Mariner's missed radio check felt different though. With Flight 19, the silence was emotional, heavy with dread. With the Mariner, it felt like the room didn't need confirmation. Everyone already knew what a missing PBM meant. If a Mariner vanished without distress calls, the odds pointed to one thing: a mid-air explosion. That twist still shakes people because the timing lines up in a way that feels almost scripted. 5 Avengers go missing. Minutes later, the rescue plane disappears in a flash reported by a passing ship. 11 more men lost, and suddenly the Navy has not one but 2 mysteries unfolding in the same patch of Atlantic at the same hour. The chilling irony sits right at the centre of that moment. The aircraft meant to find survivors became its own disaster. The rescuers needed rescuing, and the tower, already stretched thin trying to keep up with Flight 19, now had to accept that the search effort they'd pinned their hopes on had just vanished too. And when the Navy realised there'd be no wreckage to study, no survivors to interview, and no clear answers to piece together, the mystery shifted from a tragic accident to something bigger, something that kept growing with every year of silence that followed. When the Navy finally sat down to make sense of what happened, they didn't start with mystery or speculation. They started with paperwork. A lot of it. More than 500 pages of interviews, technical breakdowns, weather summaries, and contradictions stacked on top of each other. On the surface, the report looks clinical, but once you step inside it, you start to feel the struggle of investigators trying to balance the truth with the political reality of 1945. The report begins with the simplest conclusion they could defend. Taylor misidentified the islands beneath him. According to investigators, that was the spark that set everything else on fire. They believed he saw the bright streaks of Bahamian sandbars and convinced himself they were the Florida Keys. And if you think you're over the Keys, you turn north. You don't turn west. You don't follow protocol. You try to realign your position in a way that fits the picture already in your head. Once Taylor made that call, the report argues, the rest spiraled. Then the investigators move into procedure, and this part hits even harder. They state openly that Taylor ignored the one rule that could have saved the entire flight. When you're lost over the Atlantic, you fly west. Always west, that's the standard. You hit the coastline long before you run out of fuel. But Taylor didn't do that, and the report states that he actively resisted the idea. Trainee pilots suggested heading west. So did controllers. But the investigation argues that Taylor stayed locked into his belief, even as all the clues pointed the other direction. After that comes the compass issue, and this is where the tone shifts. The Navy couldn't prove the compasses failed. Not a single maintenance record supported a malfunction. No other crews reported magnetic interference that day, and the only person who insisted both compasses were broken was Taylor. The report phrases it gently. They couldn't verify any instrument failure, so if the flight leader believed his tools were lying to him, the investigators couldn't confirm it. Then there's the PBM explosion. The Navy rules it mechanical, a fuel leak meeting a spark and turning the plane into a fireball. But the real twist hits at the end of the investigation, not the beginning. Because Taylor's mother refused to accept the findings, she protested the idea that her son could have misnavigated the route. She protested that error could be blamed on one man when the Navy knew multiple systems failed that day. And once you hear what the controller claims was kept out, intentionally or not, the official story starts to feel less like a mistake and more like a disaster surrounded by silence. The part that frustrates investigators the most isn't just the disappearance itself, it's the decades of dead ends that followed. Every few years someone claims they've cracked the case. A new tip comes in, A fresh theory shows up. A photo leaks, or a diver swears they've seen something on the ocean floor. And for a moment, people think the mystery is over, only for it to crumble again. Take the submarine finds. In the 1960s and 70s, underwater expeditions were becoming the new frontier for treasure hunters and crash researchers. Subs patrolled the ocean floor off Florida, hoping to stumble onto something that finally closed the case. They did find planes, plural. TBM Avengers sitting in the sand, sometimes upside down, sometimes half buried. At first, people thought, this is it, we got them. But every single one that reached the surface had the same disappointing result. The serial numbers didn't match Flight 19. They were training accidents, emergency ditchings, mechanical failures, just not the planes the world was looking for. Then there was the Challenger-era misidentification. In the 1980s, when NASA's Challenger shuttle exploded, search and recovery teams were sweeping huge areas of the Atlantic. They were picking up debris across miles of ocean, and during that operation, they stumbled onto the wreckage of an old aircraft. The story spread fast. Some convinced themselves the crash had to be Flight 19. It made sense to them. Large search grid, deep waters, old metal. But when analysts checked, the truth was the same as before. Wrong serial numbers. A ghost, yes, but not the ghost everyone wanted. And then you get the land-based discoveries, the ones that always show up in documentaries or internet threads. The Sebastian Woods plane was one of them. A wreck deep in the trees, rotting away, with roots pushing through the cockpit. People jumped on it, saying it had to be connected. They thought maybe Taylor overshot Florida entirely and crash-landed inland. But investigators studied the remains and saw it instantly. This was a completely different model, way newer than anything from 1945. Another false lead, there's also the Everglades wreck. This one fooled a lot of locals. A TBM-like silhouette caught in the mud, visible when water levels dropped. It became a minor tourist attraction, and some swore it matched the exact shape of an Avenger. But again, when experts checked, it turned out to be a totally unrelated crash, one that actually had records, a known pilot, and a confirmed date. Just another plane swallowed by Florida's unforgiving landscape. And that's the part most people miss. The ocean and the swamp have eaten dozens of aircraft over the decades. It's not unusual to find metal, wings, engines, or fragments out there. What is unusual is that none of them ever led back to the 5 aircraft that disappeared that night. Even the Navy did its own recoveries over the years. They raised multiple TBMS from the ocean floor during routine operations. But every time a new one surfaced, the pattern repeated. Wrong serial numbers, wrong damage patterns, wrong timeline. None belonged to Taylor or his men, not one. All the while, people kept assuming they knew the general area of the crash. Most searchers stayed close to the Florida coast or the Bahamas, tracing the expected fuel range of the Avengers. But the ATC on duty that night, who listened to Taylor's voice get more frantic by the hour, believes something completely different. He insists the real wreckage is far east of everything people keep searching. Not near the Bahamas, not near Florida, not even close. Why? Because long after Taylor should have turned west, long after logic, maps, and fuel limits said the flight was past saving, he kept steering northeast. He held that direction like he was glued to it. The ATC believes Taylor's sense of direction was so scrambled that he spent his final minutes flying even farther out, into the Atlantic, far beyond their point of no return. And if that's true, then every major search effort for the last 70 years has been looking in the wrong place. The planes may be sitting thousands of feet underwater, untouched, unseen, and farther out than anyone dared to think.